Okay, so what's going on right now is that we are on our third week of raiding. We have gone through the first week of heroic raiding and normal raiding, and then 2 weeks of mythic raiding. The world first race is over, and we have even more numbers to sift through. As for Mythic Plus, we have gone through our second fortified week and third week in total after the tyrannical week in the middle of last week. So now we're going to take a look at what's been going on in the week, starting with the fastest one, the shortest one, which is going to be Mythic Plus. So with Mythic Plus, let's start by taking a look at the classes and specs, the representation and how much of them is there specifically when we go up at keys like 15 plus, if there has been any change. The spoiler is there has been, particularly for tanks and healers. So, well, compared to the last week, we left these stats to almost 10 days ago. Compared to last week, not much has changed. We did have some more prot paladins making up the percentages, but now we have to start looking at Mythic plus 15 representation and up, because now we have keys going all the way up to plus 20. There are more and more people running keys higher and higher as we get more loot, and also as Blizzard keeps nerfing several dungeons. So, in case you are not aware, in case you're not used to this, the more you go up in keys, the more the class representation and spec representation is going to drastically surge towards certain specs. For example, when you look at the tanks, despite paladins growing in Mythic 10 keys, 10 to 14 keys, when you look at 15 plus, we have the interesting change where basically every single tank loses in popularity except for the predicted Vengeance Demon Hunter, but also Brewmaster Monk. Brewmaster Monk now has even more representation. Now, when I foresaw this happening, mentioning that Brewmaster Monk would have become slowly more popular the higher the keys go, is because of the defensiveness, right? You can have two types of parties, two types of groups. Either the groups with the tank doing tons of damage, tons of DPS to help you push through packs or to help you push through tyrannical bosses, which is where you go for a Vengeance Demon Hunter. Then you have other groups that go on the defensive, that go on the safe pick for their tank. When you want to go for a safe pick, we see that Brewmaster Monk starts being picked way more. Now, obviously, all these people don't know that Guardian Druid is the pick for the safe tank. This also has to do, this type of representation, with the overall popularity of the spec. Brewmaster Monks are very popular tanks for raids. It does also make sense that they would increase in popularity over something much less popular like a Guardian Druid or a Protection Warrior. Another surprise is when we look at healers. Because when we look at the representation in 10 keys, so in seasonal affix keys with Prideful, not much changes, it's the same as last week. Restoration Shaman and Restoration Druid make up for over half of the entire healing roster. The change comes with 15. So in the 15 plus representation, we are going to get the exacerbation of picking up the strongest healer. And the surprise here, is that at 15 plus, you're going to get Resto Shamans more popular than Resto Druids. This is a momentous event. This is the first time in eons that Restoration Druid isn't the flat-out most popular healer. Now, as I mentioned, me foreseeing Brewmaster Monks becoming more popular because of their defensiveness, I did not foresee this. I left it out as a question mark when I mentioned Restoration Shaman popularity all the way back, ever since September, and then I repeated it multiple times, that Restoration Shamans could have become super popular in Mythic Plus because of how much more their heals are healing for. The problem I was putting is, what about their externals? Yes, they heal like a truck. Their heals are super strong right now, but they still don't have pain suppression, they still don't have Iron Bark, they still don't have Life Cocoon, they have no way to deal with a tank getting Gigasmack by super high, maybe magical damage that they can't mitigate very well. You do want damage reduction, and Restoration Shaman has very little for a single player. They have to start scrambling for things like Earthen Wall Totem and Spirit Link Totem, which are raid-wide super strong cooldowns, but not for a single player like a tank. And yet, we do see Restoration Shaman becoming even more popular than last week's, the higher we're going. I still reserve my judgment on this. I'm still wondering if the higher we go, the more Restoration Shaman will stay, remain, or increase its strength. I'm still pretty worried about their lack of strong tank external, especially because their Covenant ability doesn't do anything about this. Back in BFA, you could have had some essences help you with a very strong single target ability, but here you don't even have that. Your Primordial Wave, if you're a Necrolord Shaman, which you are if you're a raid healer most of the time, or if you're a Ventier, Mythic Plus Shaman, it's Chain Harvest, has nothing to do with single target healing and strong tank support, so it's gonna be interesting. When it comes to the DPS, no surprise, no changes. Going from a 10 to a 15, there is nothing other than the extremization of the specs that were already popular before. So Hunter and Mage, Marksmanship and Fire remain the more popular, with Balanced Druid also being a good choice. And when it comes to melee DPS, it's gonna be still Subtlety, Outlaw, Unholy, and Havoc Demon Hunter. We have to mention the surge of Subrog, because Subrog went from 12% to 20%, so it almost doubled its representation going higher in keys, but no other spec is getting any particular surge from maybe Red Paladin, maybe Arms or Fury Warrior or Windwalker Monk. They are still getting squeezed by these other three classes. So this week, Mythic Plus gave us a couple of surprises. The rise, you can say, of Master Monk when it comes to tanks, as well as the continued rise of Restoration Shaman over Restoration Druid. Now, you should tell me in the comments how happy are you on a scale from 1 to get the fuck to the bench when it comes to Restoration Druid not remaining so incredibly powerful in Mythic Plus anymore. We will see just how many people are happy about this. Also mention if you just re-rolled Resto Druid just to be safe, you know, just to make sure you're gonna be flavor of the month, and then you're not. Although, don't get me wrong, it's still very good in Mythic Plus, you know, it's not shit. And now, let's spend a few minutes talking about the actual dungeons for this current week. I won't bore you with the exact numbers and details anymore. I'm just gonna tell you that the easiest dungeons for the week right now for Fortified, Grievous and Spiteful, therefore the easiest dungeons when it comes to Trash, the easiest dungeons when it comes to timing 14s and 15s, are, unsurprisingly still, Mists of Ternaceet, because, you know, Mist of Ternaceet is undertuned, it's gonna remain the easiest dungeon until it gets buffed. As well as Halls of Atonement. There is a freshly made video of yours truly about Halls of Atonement and the fact that Fortified really makes it even easier than it is. There isn't that much trash, it feels like, that you have to go through, and it's not very dangerous, so you can go through this dungeon even quicker. Other easier dungeon, taking a swift turn, is going to be the other side. The other side is, of course, more threatening when it comes to Tyrannical, because Hakkar is a pretty tight DPS check. You have the Mana Storm fight, where the tank is getting hit very hard, and even Zayaxa with the Arc Lightning, which I mentioned should have been nerfed, becomes a problem, but in Fortified, it doesn't become too much of an issue. As a matter of fact, the entirety of the danger for the trash of the other side is going to be the skeletons in the outside ring before you actually enter the specific zones. Inside the specific zones, there isn't much threat. The Ardenville zone is a big bunch of AoE's dream. There's not really anything too dangerous. The Mechagon zone, beyond the trivial haywire done by the defunct Dental Drill, where you have to just loss, and then the spamming slimes that are going to do quite some damage but can be chain, interrupted, silenced, stunned and whatnot. There isn't much threat in these zones, you only have to be careful for the outside ring trash. The other easy dungeon is going to be Spires of Ascension. Spires of Ascension wasn't an easy dungeon when it came to trash. It still isn't on the same level, I think, of the other side, and especially of Mists and Halls of Atonement, but as you have watched my video, Spires of Ascension has gotten quite a few nerfs, severe nerfs to their trash. So now, it is going to be pretty interesting next week in Tyrannical to see how it changes, because we have seen how the nerfs have affected Spires of Ascension when it comes to trash, but the bosses have been mostly unchanged, except for the first boss, Kintara, and her slash, which is dodgeable, basically, by the tank, and has been nerfed by 40%. When it comes to the hardest dungeons, when it comes to trash, you have Necrotic Wake. Necrotic Wake has gotten some nerfs to their trash, particularly the Necropolis trash, you know, the Tenderize Mutilate combo that the trash do up in there, but it is still quite nasty. The whole thing, the whole combo with the Necrotic Bolt, the healing reduction, or rather the healing absorption, the whole sort of minigame, the DPS race minigame where you have to kill the Necromancer before the adds keep damaging the entire group, can become a problem in Fortified. It's really annoying to deal with. Even worse on some of these packs where you really want to rush to kill certain enemies, and you have Spiteful, which makes it even harder for melee DPS to actually deal with it. So it does remain a pretty tough dungeon. Then, as for the rest three, they are sort of in the middle. Sanguine Depths and Plagueful have among the highest success rates, while still not being among the best. I have made my video about the Plagueful dungeon. With the nerfs, Plagueful has gone more in line with the rest of the dungeons, and Sanguine Depths never had too many dangerous trash mobs. They are pretty annoying. They are pretty annoying abilities, you should say. The Grand Overseer with the Overbearing Presence and Dread Bindings is always a problem. You know, you always have to clench your butt when you have to deal with this, specifically the more melee DPS you have. The Oppressors spamming Rack Soul become a problem because in and of itself the ability, when it is let cast and interrupted and it keeps stacking up on multiple targets, your healer is not going to have enough cooldown on his Dispel to be able to deal with it, which is going to deal more and more and more damage. What also makes Sanguine Depths a little bit more of a problem is that a lot of the dungeon is a corridor. A lot of the dungeon is a single line, a single gallery for you to run through, which makes it more annoying for Spiteful. The other one, which has been a little bit on the harder side, is Theater of Pain, because, similar note, Theater of Pain in Spiteful is pretty annoying, because you are in pretty close, tight spaces. It's going to be difficult for you to actually maneuver around the more melee DPS you have, so it makes it harder than usual. Now though, we have to go over to raids, because finally, you have fucking annoyed me every week about this. Now we're talking about what's going on with Feral Druid and Windwalker Monk, okay? Happy now? Alright, shut the fuck up now. I'm talking. This was last week, and most of these logs that had at least a little bit of participation outside of like the top 10 guilds were pretty much for just the first 3 bosses. Now we have even more logs, even more reliable logs for the first 3, and just a few for Sunken Salvation, Artificer, mostly. Now, we see immediately that there is 2 things jumping to the attention, catching the eye. Number 1, Windwalker Monk has gone up a lot. Number 2, Feral Druid not only has gone up a lot, but has gone above Balanced Druid. And the spec to pay for this has been Balanced Druid, whereas Affliction Warlock also went even higher. Now, at the bottom, we still have Frost, both Mage and Death Knight. We still have Arms and Fury, we have Assassination, we have Survival, Demonology. The other big change going from the bottom to the top half is Enhancement Shaman, which has gone a little bit more up. So, Windwalker and Feral, what the fuck is going on? When it comes to Windwalker, well, they're just doing damage. There isn't really much of an explanation for Windwalker. It's not that people have to excuse themselves to explain why Windwalker is doing well. They're just doing good damage. And don't come at me, okay? I said that Windwalker was doing good damage and they had a good damage profile for raids. All I was worried about was, number 1, the tuning, because you might think right now that Frost Mage is shit. But if Frost Mage were to be buffed by 15% of their damage, now they would be at the top. Nothing changed in their spec, nothing changed in their rotation, in their talents or legendaries. They are just doing top damage because of tuning. And Windwalker is sort of the same. I warned Blizzard that this was shit balancing, this thing right here. You can't start this one giving you 10% haste for 10 seconds and then turning it into what the fuck this is. Really? 33% haste for 20 seconds? So when I was talking about Windwalker's damage profile is something like this. This is Windwalker, okay? If you don't know about Windwalker, this is Storm, Earth and Fire. And then mixed in with a combination of their Covenant ability and their Zhuen, depending on the timing of the cooldowns. And that's how it looks. So, strictly speaking, this type of damage profile is among the best types you can have for a raid. Even more so if you're a melee DPS. Trying to explain you why, if you're not a Mythic Raider. This is because bosses are going to have important moments they want to be taking more damage, and then less important moments. It's because sometimes an ad is spawning and he has to die very quickly, and then you have a downtime of 30 to 40 seconds where damage doesn't matter. Or you have bosses split in different phases. You know, phase 1 is important 4 out of 10, and then phase 2 is important 10 out of 10. So you want to pool DPS, cooldowns, potions, and making sure you have the most damage possible because you want to make the specific phase go away as fast as possible. If you guys have done from Nyalota something like Shadar. Shadar had a very annoying phase in the middle. You were bloodlusting in the middle. You were using your cooldowns in the middle because that phase was fucking terrible for you and your healers, and you wanted to make it go away. The strength of Windwalker is having short-ish cooldown in Storm and Fire. 2 charges of 1.5 minute cooldown allows you to spread or even condense the cooldown however you want. The fact that now you have been, further enhanced in your burst thanks to Zhuen being baseline, no longer costing you a talent, and the fact that now Zhuen also has been given the touch of that passive of dealing extra 10% of the damage you have dealt in the last 4 seconds, which means you can stack it up on top of other cooldowns to make it become even bigger, as well as the extra cooldowns that they now are using, at least Raid Windwalker Monks, which is Weapons of Order, extra damage, even more so. It makes them have a very good profile. I specifically mentioned this type of profile being better for melee is because melee DPS usually tend to have more disruption, more downtime, more times they have to fuck off and do something else, and being prohibited from hitting the boss, reaching the boss. Having condensed burst windows allows the monk to say, okay, I'm gonna use the burst window when I know I can stay on the boss, and then when I have to do other stuff, my damage is shit anyways, so it doesn't matter. As opposed to a spec, for example, that has a consistent and continuous 8 out of 10 damage. The more time they are disrupted, the worse it is for them. Arms Warrior is a good example of this trope. Even more so in execute phase. Another good thing for Windwalker compared to other previous expansions and tiers and whatnot was their single target damage. So Windwalker, I don't know if you remember, was Flavor of the Month, very powerful spec in Legion Mythic Plus because of their AoE. Their problem remained their single target. Now, their single target is pretty strong. A lot of these rankings, when you try to look them more in depth, boss by boss, so not just looking at the overall, where a bunch of shit between AoE and single target get mixed in. Windwalker is, 4th on Shriekwing, it's like 4th on Altimore, 5th on Hungering Destroyer. It's doing just fine. Not to mention, don't forget, most of the melee DPS are below range DPS. So saying, for example, Windwalker Monk is 4th on Altimore actually reads is the second best performing melee DPS spec. Saying they are 6th on Hungering Destroyer actually means they are the second best performing melee DPS spec as well. Their single target damage has significantly increased at face value, at front value, also thanks to Coordinated Offensive, the potency conduit that is going to give you increased single target damage inside your burst. Now, you have seen how high the burst is. You see how concentrated the damage of Windwalker is, so this type of potency conduit gives you even more single target damage in the best possible phase you want it in, which is throughout your Storm, Earth, and Fire burst. Now, I say face value, front value, because I have to mention the same fears I had about Windwalker when I mentioned it the first time months ago. So I actually put Windwalker when it came to DPS rankings for raids, and that was before a bunch of changes and whatnot, but I were putting it in the middle of the pack. I didn't think it was bad or it was at the bottom. My fear with Windwalker was the scaling. A potency conduit like Coordinated Offensive, for example, doesn't scale with anything. It just flat out increases your damage. It doesn't give you more secondary stats. It doesn't make you proc more passives. You don't have anything that is going to scale later into the expansion that is going to increase the effectiveness of something else in your kit. I made an entire video about this, dedicated to the bad scaling of specs, also using Windwalker Monk as an example. The Legendary also has no scaling. The Legendary is just more haste during your burst. It's gonna stay like this and not scale better than this in the future. Think about, for example, the Firemail Legendary. 3% more stacking crit whenever you crit. That scales with your secondary stats throughout the expansion. Or, for example, a Legendary that scales like shit, like Serpent Stalker's Trickery. Aim shot giving you a free Serpent Sting. Once Serpent Sting is on the target, that's it. It doesn't scale with anything, it doesn't do anything extra. It's not gonna be very good later on, compared to other legendaries that can scale better. So that is my fear. My fear for Windwalker is that a lot of the power they are getting front end is going to devalue itself over time. It is also the similar fear I have for something like Vengeance Demon Hunter and the way they tank Mythic Plus through their damage and their self-healing, which can be devalued over time. Same for Restoration Shaman and their lack of external, etc, etc. So we will have to see about this point. Now the other forgotten spec, I said shut up. I know about this spec, I have heard of this before, it's Feral Druid. So if there is a spec that is also outdoing expectations, it's Feral Druid. Now Feral Druid has had high-ish logs in theory, or actually not in theory, logs are real. High logs, other expansions before. I remember even back in WoD was having high, DPS on paper, on single target. But now I think it is more consistent and more significant than other expansions. So much so that it is worth a mention. Because the first mention we have to go through is their damage profile. This is Windwalker, if you remember from 5 minutes ago, and this is Feral. So Feral still doesn't have some incredible burst, but that's not what Feral wanted. The only thing Feral wanted was any burst, like at all. Because the biggest problem of Feral forever, since the dawn of time, was the fact that they had too much ramp up, too much maintenance time having to be spent on reapplying and snapshotting dots like Rip and Rake, and it just took them too much time to do significant damage. Now we do have a Covenant ability that is going to drastically change the way Feral Druid works, at no cost whatsoever, because it's one button. It doesn't require you to spec a certain way or to focus on certain secondary stats or change the way you play. You literally click it once and you get what you have not had for like 6 years. Actually, since forever, but more specifically for the past few expansions. Convoke the Spirits gives you a fuck ton of burst, which you didn't have before, and is now making you much more relevant as a spec. Do you need to do double damage on Sludge Fist when he slams on top of a pillar? You're a Feral, you get benched. Now you have Convoke the Spirits, you don't get benched. Do you need to break the shield of the Shade of Kel'Thas 3 times in 30 seconds? You're a Feral, you get benched. Now you have Convoke the Spirits, you don't get benched anymore. This can be applied to a multitude of bosses with a multitude of priority adds and targets that want to be taken down, which now Feral Druid can have a legitimate hand in helping, thanks to this single ability. It is still not as powerful as Convoke the Spirits from a Balanced Druid. Balanced Druids still gain the benefit of being able to cast Full Moon in balanced form, something that a Feral Druid is not gonna get. And Feral Druid, unluckily for them, doesn't have a very strong hitting ability in a talent that they could get for free in Convoke the Spirits. So it just doesn't do as much. Still, that's how broken Convoke the Spirits is when it comes to burst. It is still very, very relevant for them. I do also enjoy, unlike Windwalker, which is extremely on rails when it comes to the type of damage and the type of spec you're going for, Feral Druid can actually vary a little bit in the type of damage they want to do, whether it is more Ferocious Bite focused, whether it is more dot focused or burst focused. Conflux of Elements is the conduit that you can use for more burst, for more damage in your Convoke. You can use the all-rounder, used most of the time, Taste for Blood, which gives your Ferocious Bite a increased damage based on the amount of bleeds. But the bigger change is the level of variety in your legendaries. If you are a Feral Druid, you can go for the absolute pure single target, which is Drought of Deep Focus. But then, whenever you start having more adds and more secondary targets, you can go for the Apex Predator's Craving, thanks to having multiple rips out, giving you multiple resets, multiple free Ferocious Bites. And you can even go, the more targets, with Circle of Life and Death, for multiple dots ticking faster. This also allows you to change your damage profile. You can get, for example, to almost 50% of your damage coming from Ferocious Bite with much less dot damage, or you can cut down to almost 35% of Ferocious Bite damage with almost doubling your dot damage, purely based on your choice of legendaries and, to a lesser degree, conduits. Now, the other thing that is actually quite relevant is the extra hand Feral Druids can get over other melee DPS. Why? Because most of the time, of course, a Feral Druid is not really gonna use Convoke the Spirits with their Moonkin form. They're not really gonna be doing balanced Druid damage. But you are a melee DPS. Sometimes you have to fuck off. Sometimes you don't get to hit the boss. What happens? Well, other specs are going to sit and roll their thumbs. What happens with a Feral Druid is that they get to have 4 to 5% of their damage coming from their Moonkin form. This is damage that other melee DPS don't get to do. When you have to run away, right? When you have to run away from Hungering Destroyer, when you're trying to be pulled by Artificial Zymox, or maybe you are carrying a seed, or you have to run away with a portal, and as a melee DPS you're doing nothing, a Feral Druid has the ability to use Moonfire instantly, no cast time needed, so they can use it on the run. They can use Sunfire, and then they can also, of course, use Star Surge. These are all benefits that other melee DPS don't get to have. Now, you think it's irrelevant, but over time, over like a 5 or 6 minute fight with quite a few movement situations, I mentioned Hungering Destroyer, but even something like Council of Blood, where you are running out with the dance. As a melee DPS you do nothing, as a Feral Druid you have the ability to still do damage. Similar thing can be said if you are, for example, on Denatrius and you have to spread out for Impale, or you have to spread out for the blades on the ground. Feral Druid can sneak in extra damage that other melee DPS specs can't. at least not effectively. A Red Paladin can throw in a Judgment, maybe a Blade of Justice if it's close enough. A DK can still use that coil. Maybe they can use Scourge Strike with the talent, but not nearly as much as a Feral Druid. So I think this is actually pretty interesting. It is a pretty interesting situation when it comes to the damage currently going on in raids. Do you think this is going to change anything? Do you think that if Feral Druid is going to continue doing pretty good damage, that they will become, you know, flavor of the month and people will start re-rolling to them over the next year, for example? No, I don't. They still don't bring a single raid buff or a raid debuff, and they don't have an immunity. It's very unlikely that they will be stacked. Plus, of course, they are a melee DPS, so... Then again, you could make the case, for example, for Unholy DK being stacked, but stacking Unholy DKs not only gives you something invaluable as a grip, but also gives you something even more invaluable, which is an anti-magic zone, which is a legit healing external, which is much more valuable than anything a Feral Druid could bring. So I don't think it's going to change anything. If you are one of the 34 Feral Druid players, you don't have to worry about losing your hipster status and flavor of the month rerollers coming to your spec to get all the glory. I don't think you're going to be in trouble. This was all for the current week of Mythic Plus and Raid performances. Tomorrow maybe, as I roll along, maybe another dungeon review. We're going to also look at the progression in raids and a couple of other things I've left out because this video is fucking long. So, the last thing that is left to mention is that I intentionally left out of any judgment and reviewing Elemental Shaman, because if you hear the rumbling in the distance, that is the best in slot legendary for Elemental Shaman coming live at a world boss near you in just a couple dozen hours. This is also a good time to thank Blizzard. Very generous of Blizzard to let us have our best in slot legendary only 40 days after the expansion launched. Very, very charitable. Thank you. So, with this, we are done. We are going to take a break and see each other tomorrow, probably, likely. So, it is time to take my leave. I have fulfilled my monthly quota of extensively talking about Windwalker and Feral, so now you have to leave me alone. If anyone mentions what about survival, I'm going to send a fucking SWAT team to break down your door and sodomize you. Are we clear? Okay. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I'm going to set up a campfire in front of Valinor.